Hello, my name is Matthew Sear, and I am recording a video to demonstrate the added JavaScript functionality for my case manager on Rails application that I built for my previous project. So I updated the application to meet the requirements for this JavaScript add-on. So has the Rails backend and these new requirements that are listed are implemented through JavaScript. Mostly it involves translating JSON responses that include the data from the models I am using into objects that I can then use to append information to the page without a refresh, including an index page, a show page, and it also has to render information using a model that has many relationships. So the caseload has many clients. Relationships is what we're going to be using there, and the caseload index is what's going to be shown, and also the caseload show page. And then the other thing is having a form that, when submitted, renders whatever was created on the same page without a refresh. So we're going to use a new client for that, and call some of the prototype methods on the objects that are created in this process. So I'm going to kind of go through and show how things work real quick before explaining the code. So not much has changed with the functionality of the application itself. Nothing at all, really. It's just using JavaScript now instead of the Rails or the Ruby files, the embedded Ruby files, the HTML views. So like I said, I did the all caseloads page. Right now, if you click on something like my account, obviously you'll notice that the URL changes because it's going to that page, and it's rendering the view, so it's a complete refresh. It has to redirect to that page. But with all caseloads, it should just actually intercept the click and then show the list of caseloads, and you can see that the URL did not change there. Now if we go to the caseloads page, there's a comment that's rendering there, which I'll have to take out, but it's formatted pretty much the same way. I don't think that this one has numbers on it, but basically the point is that, instead of having to get this caseloads path, all we have to do is click on this, and it'll kind of repaint the document object model with the dynamically generated HTML through the JavaScript. So to do that, I had to, in the caseload controller file, change the way that the data is loaded depending on how it's accessed. So it responds to the normal GET requests like it did whenever I visited the actual URL with the HTML view. But whenever I clicked on the link to view all caseloads, it is using JSON in the JavaScript file to create objects and render them that way. So it renders the JSON, and it serializes the information from the JSON object here. And it's kind of set up the same way as the caseload model file with the same relationships. And then we also can list the attributes that we get whenever we retrieve the JSON. So for example, if we go here and do it that way, we get the JavaScript object notation, which includes the user for the caseload, who's the case manager, user, it's kind of interchangeable for this app, and then all the clients within that caseload, as well as some information about them, basically just their first and last name. So that is then being used here. So as we can see, whenever the document loads, there's the bind click handlers function that gets loaded so that, or the constant that gets loaded so that we can intercept the default behavior, or I'm sorry, prevent the default behavior by intercepting that click on the all caseloads link. And instead of loading the view, it fetches the JSON from the URL that we give it, which is the caseloads.json that we just viewed in the browser. So it's getting that same information, and then formulating. Once it gets the JSON, it gets a promise, and then the promise generates a response object that we can use to actually generate some objects. So the data that's being returned here is being iterated through on this for each, or with this for each function, and we are generating from each object in that array that's returned a new caseload using this constructor function, and the caseload then assigns attributes based on the data that it received. And with that, then we can use the prototype method that we have written here below, this format index prototype method. We can call it on the caseload objects that are being rendered, or that are being created, and then render them in the document object model, like so, creating these list items. So that's it's pretty straightforward whenever you look at the progression of the process. At first I thought that this was a little bit more convoluted than just doing it with Ruby and using the embedded views, but the value of not having to request a new page and having that refresh is good for more complex applications, so that there's not a lot of time wasted on reloading assets that are already rendered and just taking out and replacing what we need to with the new data that's generated. So once we go to the all caseloads page, and we can actually click on the caseloads in the list, and you'll notice again the URL does not change, and it renders dynamically the individuals who are on the caseload, along with a link to create a new note for them. So that's achieved pretty much the same way. There's actually a little bit of complexity with getting the correct attributes to generate the links dynamically, because since this is, like, the caseload itself doesn't really have much information, we have to use the caseload, not the caseload ID, but the client ID from the caseload to create the links here. And to create the note is the same thing. We use that client ID for that new note link. The issue with the creating the links for the format index page is actually where the complexity comes in. I'm sorry, because since it's a nested URL, or a nested route, the URL is users/user ID / caseload / this ID. So we have to create some custom attributes in the HTML so that we can actually get that those numbers for the IDs and put them into the links. So it's kind of neat how that works, because we're getting the data in a somewhat roundabout way and putting it in a place where we can access it to then create these links for an accurate index page. And then the final element of the project involves rendering the content from a newly created object, in this case a client, from the form once it's just submitted without having to refresh the page. So I actually made another JavaScript file for the client, and whenever the page loads, there's this client submit function or constant that is loaded, and it kind of works in the same way. So the default behavior of creating a new client, or clicking on this submit button on the new client form, is prevented. So instead of posting the way that we usually would through the Rails routes, we're going to use the jQuery post and submit or substitute in here the client's URL to which the new client is going to be posted, using the values that are serialized from the form, whatever the user enters here. And so once we get a response back from posting the values to clients to create the new client, we get some data back from that once it's done. And I'll also point out here that in the client's controller, for our create method, we're going to render this client as opposed to redirecting to the client show page like we might have before we implemented the JavaScript. So once we get that response back, we can do pretty much the same thing that we were doing with the other stuff there. We can clear out the main div on the page and create new client objects and use that information from the client objects to generate dynamic HTML, which is then appended to that same div. So if we create, I hope I'm spelling that correctly, a new client, you'll see that it remains on client/new instead of redirecting to clients/ whatever the ID would be, for example, for the show page, and it dynamically renders all of that content there. And so we have a link to the caseload that they belong to, a list of all their notes, and a link to being able to edit the client that we just created. So yeah, nothing really about the app has changed functionally, like I said, except it's a little bit quicker. Probably not in a noticeable way, since the app is not very complex in the first place, so I don't think really much would have changed with how fast it was compared to just the straight Rails version. But I like that things are dynamically generated because it makes it easier to create new things or render things that might have otherwise taken more time because of the page refreshes and having to load other assets and whatnot. So I think that's everything that's changed. So yeah, thank you for watching.